Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more untold history. In 1890, deep in the Ozark Hills, three sisters appeared whose very presence stirred fear. Whispers of sickness, death, and curses followed them until their story was buried from memory. This is the sinister legend of the Wanderer Sisters. The Ozark Mountains in the late 1800s were a world apart from the cities and coasts of America. The ridges rose like the backs of sleeping giants, their hollers thick with oak and hickory, their valleys cut with creeks that whispered against stone. Life here was harsh, beautiful, and strangely private. Families lived scattered along dirt, paths that barely deserved to be called roads. Neighbors were sometimes miles apart, and word of mouth carried stories faster than any printed page. Out here, truth and superstition blurred, and sometimes the two became the same thing. By 1890, this was still frontier country in many ways. The railroads had started to snake their way through Missouri, but the deeper parts of the Ozarks resisted change. Folks grew their food, raised hogs, traded with one another, and kept mostly to themselves. There was a mistrust of outsiders, but also a hunger for tale of stories that could explain the unexplainable or warn the young about dangers best left unseen. This was the land of whispered curses, of ghost lights moving through the trees, of songs sung low by firelight. When the wind carried too many secrets, it was here that the legend of the Wanderer Sisters was born. Some swore it was just a fireside tale told by old men with too much whiskey in their bellies. Others claimed it was something darker, something real, though nobody dared write it down in the local papers. The story was dangerous. So dangerous, in fact, that it was said to have been banned from history, spoken only in whispers, and even then, only when one was sure the sisters were not listening. Their real names are lost or may be hidden. What's left in fragments of oral history is only this: three sisters born somewhere near the Arkansas border, who arrived in the Missouri Ozarks like strangers who had already walked too far. They did not stay in one place. They did not settle like most families. They wandered, taking up in abandoned cabins or in empty farmhouses left behind by men who went off west chasing gold and never returned. Wherever they went, misfortune followed. They were described as pale women, tall and severe, with eyes too sharp to look at for long. One of them, the eldest, wore her hair black as coal and tied back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a mask. The middle one was red-haired, though some said it wasn't the color of fire but the color of dried blood. And the youngest, she was said to be the strangest of all. Her eyes almost colorless, her voice thin as wind through a graveyard gate. People said they never smiled. They never asked for help, never came to church, and never seemed to age. They appeared in a hollow one season, then were gone the next, moving like shadows from ridge to ridge. And when they left, bad luck clung to the places they had touched. It began with animals. Hogs found with their throats cut, chickens gone missing, milk cows refusing to give. Then came the sicknesses, strange fevers that the old remedies couldn't cure. Babies born weak, men struck down by accidents that seemed too cruel to be chance. And always, the sisters were there, standing just outside the circle of normal life. Watching, waiting, like the earth itself had given them leave to walk and curse and vanish. But it wasn't only their presence that haunted people. It was what they did in the woods. A farmer passing home late at night once claimed he saw them circling a bonfire deep in the timber, their pale dresses catching sparks of firelight, their arms raised as though calling to something that lived beyond human eyes. Another swore he heard a sound like singing, not in English, not in any tongue he knew, drifting through the trees on a night when no woman should have been out walking. For most, these were only warning signs to stay away, to keep to ones. own farm and hearth. But for a few unlucky souls, crossing paths with the Wanderer sisters meant more than fear. It meant death. The first killing tied to them came in the summer of 1890, when a trapper named Eli Branson failed to return home. His wife, worried sick, sent her oldest boy to look for him. They found Eli's body 2 days later by the edge of a creek, his skin pale as milk, his eyes wide open. His hands clawed into the dirt as though he'd tried to hold on to life with every last ounce of strength. There was no mark on him, no wound, no bullet hole, no sign of drowning. Only the terrible look on his face, as though he had seen something that struck the soul dead before the body could follow. Folks whispered, but none dared accuse. Still, one name was repeated under breath, passed like a curse itself: the sisters. After Eli, more followed. Not always dead, not always found, but always gone from the rhythm of life. A girl of 12 vanished walking home from her aunt's place. A man known to drink too much wandered into the woods and was never seen again. A midwife who tended to mothers in the hills fell ill, her skin gray, her eyes hollow, and her voice gone. She lasted only 3 days before her husband found her cold, and each time someone said they saw a figure at the tree line. Sometimes 1, sometimes 3, watching, silent, waiting. The Ozarks were a place of strong belief, and fear grew like weeds in the minds of the people. Some called the sisters witches, others called them cursed, carrying the sins of their bloodline across the hills like a plague. Still others said they were not human at all, but something older, something the hills themselves had birthed and loosed upon the living. What made it worse was that the law could not, or would not, touch them. Sheriffs came and went in those counties, but none dared bring charges without proof. And proof was the one thing the sisters never left behind. Death and vanishing had no fingerprints, no signatures, only silence and fear. By the fall of that year, the people of the Ozarks began to change. Men carried rifles to their fields. Women locked their doors and hung crosses over their windows. Children were told not to wander past the fence line, not even to chase a ball or a stray dog. Whole families packed up and moved away, saying they would rather risk the unknown than live under the shadow of the Wanderer sisters. Yet the sisters remained. They never fled, never defended themselves, never even spoke to those who cursed them. They simply were. Like the trees, like the rocks, like the fog that rose each morning. Their silence was worse than denial, for it gave no foothold for reason. It left only terror. It was in this silence that the legend took its darkest turn. One night in November, as frost turned the fields silver, a gathering was held at the old mill house by the creek. Men and women came from miles, their lanterns bobbing through the night like lost stars. Inside, they whispered of what was to be done. They spoke of the killings, the vanishings, the fear that had turned their lives into shadows. And at last, someone said aloud what many had already thought. The sisters had to be stopped. But how does one stop a curse? How does one destroy something? That leaves no evidence, no tracks, no wounds. Some said fire. Some said rope. Others said prayer. But beneath all the voices was a deeper dread. One no one wanted to name that, whatever the sisters were, they might not be killable at all. Still, men are men, and when cornered by fear, they choose action over paralysis. A small band was formed that night, sworn to put an end to the Wanderer sisters, to rid the Ozarks of their presence once and for all. They did not call themselves vigilantes. They called themselves protectors. But history, if it had remembered them, might have called them something else entirely. And so, under the cold stars of an Ozark winter, the hunt began. The hunt began not with guns blazing, but with whispers and watchfulness. These were not men eager for glory, nor men drunk on power. They were farmers, millers, trappersmen, who had buried children, buried friends, buried livestock, and could not bear to bury more. They met in barns with the lanterns turned low, their words hushed so the night itself would not betray them. In their hands they carried old rifles from the war, shotguns patched with wire, axes worn smooth by years of work. A few brought charms handed down from their grandmother's bags of salt, iron nails, scraps of scripture folded into leather. They did not know if such things would work, but they knew they would need more than bullets if the stories about the sisters were true. For weeks they watched. They tracked where the sisters were seen. They noted which hollow carried their footsteps, which farmhouses went dark after their passing. They marked the sound of singing in the woods and the strange fires that flickered where no farmer had laid brush. The sisters never stayed in one place more than a season, but winter had slowed their wandering. By late December, they had taken to an abandoned cabin on the edge of Brush Creek, where the timber pressed close and the hills rose steep and unwelcoming. The cabin had once belonged to a family that tried to carve a living out of the stone and scrub, but the land was poor and they had left for Arkansas years before. Since then, it had rotted in silence, its roof sagging, its windows broken, its chimney leaning like a tired old man. Now it stood alive again, but not with life anyone welcomed. Smoke rose from its crooked flue. Strange marks were said to have been scratched on the trees nearby, circles and crosses that seemed to change when no one was looking. The men decided this was where it must end, on the coldest night of the season. Under a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. They set out. They did not march as soldiers, but crept as hunters, their boots muffled in the snow, their breaths hidden in scarves. Every man felt the weight of what they carried, not just weapons, but the burden of doing what their preachers and sheriffs would not. Some say there were 7 of them, others say 12. Their names drift in and out of the telling. Maybe Elias, maybe Carter, maybe a man called Finch who never spoke of what happened afterward. The truth has been worn away like the face of a stone in water, but all agree on this. When they came within sight of the cabin, they felt fear like they had never known. The windows glowed faintly with firelight, though the hour was late. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, and inside, through the cracked slats, they saw movement. 3 shadows crossing back and forth, their forms long and unnatural in the flicker of the flames. The men paused. For a moment, every hand shook. It was not the cold. It was the feeling that they were not stalking women, but something else entirely. Still, they pressed on. To turn back was to invite the curse upon their own homes. They surrounded the cabin, spreading themselves among the trees, hearts pounding in the frozen dark. The leader, whoever he was, lifted his rifle and gave a nod. That was the signal. What happened next is the heart of the legend. Some say they stormed the cabin, axes splintering the door, rifles blazing. Others claim they set fire to the roof first, hoping to drive the sisters out like wild game. Still others whisper that the men never even touched the place that something inside moved first. What all the versions agree on is this: the sisters did not run. When the door burst inward, the men found them standing in the center of the single room, waiting. The eldest with her black hair bound tight, her eyes sharp and unblinking. The red-haired one with her hands folded before her, her mouth curved in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. And the youngest, pale as bone, her gaze distant, as if she were listening to a voice no one else could hear. No scream, no plea, no sign of fear. One of the men shouted for them to come out, to face judgment. Another leveled his rifle and fired. The shot cracked like thunder inside the cabin. When the smoke cleared, the eldest sister was still standing. The bullet had torn through her dress at the shoulder, but no blood showed, only pale skin unmarked. She tilted her head like a crow watching something curious, and the firelight glimmered in her eyes. Panic broke then. Shots rang out, wild and desperate. Flames from the hearth jumped high, licking the rafters. The men swore later that the sisters began to sing not words, not any language, but a sound that crawled under the skin. A rising wail that bent the mind like heat bends the air. One man dropped his gun and clutched his ears, screaming until his voice broke. Another staggered back as if struck, blood running from his nose and mouth. A third fell to his knees, muttering prayers that made no sense. His eyes rolled back white. Still, the sisters stood. Still, they sang. It was then someone maybe. The leader, maybe some nameless farmer, snatched up the oil lamp and hurled it at the floor. Fire spread fast, racing across dry boards and old straw, climbing the walls like a beast hungry for breath. In the chaos, the men fled, dragging the stunned and the broken out into the night. Behind them, the cabin roared with flames. The sisters did not emerge. Not when the roof caved, not when the walls collapsed, not when the sparks flew high into the black sky. The men waited, rifles aimed, until nothing was left but embers glowing red in the snow. At last, silence fell. The men looked at one another, faces hollow with exhaustion and terror. No bodies had been found. No screams had come from within. Only the memory of those three figures standing calm as death while the world burned around them. They told no one what they had seen. Not in detail, not the singing, not the bloodless wound, not the terror that had seized their hearts. 2. Their families, they said simply that the curse was ended, the sisters gone. To their neighbors, they swore the danger was over, and for a time, seemed they were right. The winter passed into spring, and no new sicknesses struck. No cattle were found mutilated. No children vanished on the roads. For the first time in years, the people of the Ozarks breathed easy. They returned to their fields, their barns, their lives. The legend of the sisters began to fade, told only in hushed tones as a warning of what once had been. But the hills are old, and they do not forget. By the second harvest, stories began to stir again. A woman traveling alone near Brush Creek swore she saw three figures watching her from the ridge, pale against the dark trees. A hunter claimed he found a circle of stones deep in the woods, with ashes still warm, though no fire should have been there. And a boy, wandering too far from home, came back trembling, saying he had heard voices calling his name, though no one was there. The men who had gone to the cabin grew uneasy. Some drank too much, their sleep plagued by nightmares. One took to carrying iron nails in his pockets at all times, muttering that he could still hear the singing if the wind was right. Another was found wandering the woods in a daze, barefoot. In the snow, his lips cracked and bloody as he whispered about eyes watching him from the trees. None of them lived long. One by one, accidents claimed them. A fall from a barn roof, a misfired rifle, a fever that burned hot and sudden. Their deaths were written off as chance, but those who remembered the night at the cabin knew better. The sisters had not been destroyed. They had only been waiting, and so the legend grew darker still. It was said the Wanderer sisters could not be killed by fire or bullet. It was said they moved with the seasons, never staying long enough to be caught, always leaving ruin in their wake. It was said that to look too long into their eyes was to feel your soul slip loose, as if your body no longer belonged to you by the time the century turned. Families spoke of them only in whispers, and children were warned never to wander far from home, never to follow strange lights in the woods, never to answer if they heard their name called from the dark. And perhaps most chilling of all was the tale, told by an old woman in the town of Ava in 1902. She claimed that when she was a girl, she had seen the sisters herself. But they were not three anymore. They were four. By 1902, the Ozarks were changing. The railroad brought more than just steel and smoke. It carried new people, new laws, and new ways of thinking. The small towns along the ridges began to look less like frontier outposts and more like settled places with proper churches, schools, and stores stocked with goods that had traveled halfway across the country. But in the deep hollows and far ridges, where the timber pressed thick and the creeks cut their secrets into the stone, the old ways lingered. It was in those hidden places that the story of the wanderer Sister still lived. The younger generation had grown up on the tales, not knowing whether to treat them as warnings or as superstition. But the elders remembered the fear. They remembered the sickness, the vanishings, the cabin fire that was supposed to end it all. And they remembered the men who swore the sisters were gone only to fall one by one into the grave. So when the old woman in Ava told her story, people listened. Her name was Martha Hensley. She was 70 by then, her back bent, her eyes cloudy with age. She had outlived her husband, outlived most of her children, and spent her days in a rocking chair on her porch, watching the world pass slow. Folks often came to her for stories of the old times, for she had a mind like a trap and a tongue that liked to wander. But what she told that spring chilled even the boldest listener. She said she had seen the sisters when she was just a girl, no older than 12. It was the summer of 1849, long before the troubles of the 1890s. She and her brother had been sent to fetch water from a spring near their home, a walk that took them through a thicket of woods. It was there she saw them 3 women, pale and strange, standing in a clearing as though they were waiting for someone. They did not speak, did not move, only watched the children pass. Her brother told her never to mention it. And she hadn't, not until now. But what she saw years later proved the sisters were not bound by time as normal folk are. One evening, round the turn of the century, she had been traveling with her son's family through the hills, moving toward a cousin's place near Gainesville. As the wagon rolled past a stretch of woods, Martha glanced toward the ridge. There they were again. The same 3 figures' faces unchanged, hair the same as before. Not aged a day in 50 years. Only this time there was another. A 4th figure stood with them, smaller than the rest. A girl, pale as the others, her eyes hollow and strange. She did not look older than 15, but she carried herself with the same terrible stillness, the same unearthly calm. And when Martha saw her, the girl turned her head, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. Martha swore she felt her chest seize, as though her heart had been squeezed by invisible hands. She gasped, nearly fainting, and her son had to grab the reins to keep the wagon steady. She looked again, and the ridge was empty. But she knew what she had seen. The sisters were not only alive, they had multiplied. The story spread through Ava and beyond. Carried on porches, in storehouses, at Sunday dinners when the children were told to leave the room. A 4th sister. Where had she come from? Was she born of the others, taken from some poor family and made into one of them? Or worse, had she been waiting all along, a shadow hidden until the time was right to step forward? Fear took root again. Strange happenings returned, slow at first, then more frequent. A barn near Bryant Creek burned to the ground in the dead of night, the horses inside screaming until their voices broke. A schoolteacher fell ill after walking home late and was found raving about voices in the trees before she died. A hunting party near Thornfield found the body of a man frozen stiff in midsummer, his flesh pale as if winter had claimed him alone. Each time, whispers followed, the sisters, but now no one dared act against them. The memory of the cabin fire still lingered, and the deaths of the men who had tried to end it served as warning. If the sisters could not be killed, then resistance was useless. Families locked their doors tighter, crossed themselves more often, and prayed harder. But prayers do little against what the earth itself protects. It was around this time that the stories began to vanish from paper. Local newspapers, eager to look respectable in the eyes of the wider world, stopped printing tales of witches and curses. Preachers warned against spreading superstition. Teachers told children that the old stories were foolish. Yet the silence only made the whispers stronger. By 1910, the Wanderer sisters were no longer just a tale of fear. They had become a shadow in the very identity of the Ozarks. They were the thing you did not talk about, but always remembered. Like a scar beneath clothing, and yet, every so often, the shadow stepped forward. In the fall of 1912, two young men from Springfield came to the hills, eager to prove themselves against the wild. They were college boys, dressed in coats too fine for the dirt roads, their boots polished, their laughter loud. They had heard the old tales and thought them amusing, nothing more than backward superstition. So they decided to seek out the Wanderer sisters for themselves. For 3 days, they roamed the ridges, mocking the locals, asking where the witches lived. They camped near Brush Creek, drank whiskey by their fire, and shouted challenges into the woods, daring the sisters to show themselves. On the 4th day, one came back. He was found stumbling along the road near Ava, his coat torn, his face scratched raw, his eyes wide and glassy. He never spoke again, not of what he had seen, not of what had happened to his friend. He lived another 40 years, but his mind was gone. He sat on porches, rocking, mumbling to himself, staring into the woods as if waiting for something. The other boy was never found. It was then the whispers grew bolder. Not only were the sisters still alive, not only had they multiplied, but they were no longer content to be left alone. They were watching, waiting, choosing, and as the years passed, the world outside the Ozarks changed in ways no one could have imagined. The Great War came, and sons were sent overseas. The Great Depression followed, leaving families hungry and desperate. Then came the Second World War, and the hills emptied again of young men. Through it all, the sisters remained. They were not touched by time, not touched by poverty or war. They lingered, silent, their presence marked only by tragedy and fear. By the 1940s, many of the old folks who remembered the first curse were dead, their graves marked by weathered stones in hillside cemeteries. But their children and their children's children carried the warning still. Don't walk the ridges after dark. Don't answer voices in the woods. Don't speak of the sisters aloud. And still, there were sightings. A farmer near Ava swore he saw 4 women standing in his cornfield one dawn, their dresses wet with dew, their eyes fixed on his house. A group of children playing near the White River claimed they saw pale figures watching from the trees, only to vanish when the adults came running. A soldier home from the war was found dead in his barn, his face twisted in terror, his body cold though the day was hot. The sisters were no longer just part of the past. They had become part of the present, woven into the life of the Ozarks like the stone beneath the soil. But perhaps the most chilling part of the legend is this. By the mid-century, no one spoke of 3 or 4. The number was always changing. Some said 5, some said 6. The sisters were multiplying, and with each telling, the fear grew sharper, until at last the whispers stopped altogether. Not because people forgot, but because they dared not remember. The story was buried. The Wanderer sisters, once a terror that kept children close to home and men awake at night, were erased from the official memory of the Ozarks. No more mentions in papers, no more notes in diaries. Preachers would cut short any mention from their pulpits. Families told their children only half the warnings, stripped of names and detail. The story was banned from history, pushed into silence by fear. But silence does not kill a curse, it only buries it deeper. And the deeper a thing is buried, the stronger it grows. By the middle of the 20th century, the Wanderer sisters had become a ghost in the collective memory of the Ozarks. The name was no longer spoken in schools or churches, and the story had been cut from the printed page. If a stranger asked about them, the old-timers would simply shake their heads and change the subject. Families still hung charms over their doors, still warned their children not to wander past the tree line, but they no longer said why. It was as though the sisters had been swallowed whole by silence, but silence has a way of amplifying fear. When stories are buried, they do not die, they ferment. They grow stronger in the dark, like roots spreading unseen beneath the soil. And when the soil shifts, they surface again, alive and poisonous. That is what happened with the legend of the Wanderer sisters. The first modern stirrings came in the 1960s, a time when the Ozarks themselves were changing fast. Highways cut through hills that had once been nearly impassable. Tourists came to fish the rivers and camp under the stars. Cities like Branson began to rise, promising neon lights and music shows where once there had been only silence. Outsiders poured in, hungry for the rustic charm of a world they thought untouched. But the hills have always kept their secrets. In 1964, a group of college students from St. Louis took a trip into the Ozarks, eager to experience the real backwoods life. They pitched their tents near Brush Creek, not far from where the old cabin had once stood. That night, around the fire, a local guide told them a fragment of the old story, the tale of the three sisters who could not be killed by fire. He laughed as he told it, brushing it off as superstition. But the students were intrigued. They decided to go looking. They were never heard from again. Only their camp remained. The fire burned out, the tents torn, their belongings scattered. Search parties combed the hills for weeks, but no trace was ever found. The authorities chalked it up to getting lost or to running off on some foolish adventure. But those who remembered the old stories knew better. The sisters had been seen again. The 1970s brought more. A hunter claimed he found a ring of stones in the woods, the ashes inside still warm, though he had seen no smoke. A woman driving home one night near Ava swore she saw a pale figure in the road ahead. And when she braked, it vanished, leaving only the echo of a strange song in her ears. In 1979, a man named Charles Garner, a carpenter from Springfield, bought land near the White River and began to build a cabin for his family. One evening, while he worked alone, he heard voices outside, women's voices, soft singing. He stepped out to look, thinking it might be neighbors. What he saw instead was 4 women standing at the tree line, watching. They were pale, unmoving, their eyes reflecting the last light of dusk. Charles dropped his hammer and ran. He never finished the cabin. By the 1980s. The Wanderer sisters were whispered about again, though never in public. Local law enforcement quietly admitted strange disappearances in the region, but nothing ever made the papers. And yet, the legend spread in hushed tones, carried like contraband between families who knew to be careful. The strangest thing was how the numbers kept changing. Some sightings spoke of 4, some of 5, a few of 6. Always pale, always silent, always watching. No one knew whether the sisters multiplied by birth, by curse, or by some darker means. Some believed they drew new members from the living girls, who wandered too far from home, who vanished into the woods and were never seen again. Others thought the sisters were endless, that their numbers had no limit, that they were as much a force of the hills as the rivers and stones. By the 1990s, the story had become dangerous again. Not because people didn't believe, but because some did. A group of thrill-seekers from Kansas City came to the Ozarks to film a documentary about real haunted America. They interviewed old-timers, recorded the stories, and camped near the site of the burned cabin. Only one tape was ever recovered. On it, the camera shakes violently. The voices of the crew panicked. In the background, faint but unmistakable, is the sound of women singing. The film ends abruptly, the screen black. The crew was never found. The tape was quietly buried by the authorities. But a copy survived, passed from hand to hand in whispers. Those who claimed to have seen it said the singing was like nothing human, a sound that made the hair rise on the back of the neck, a sound that stayed in the mind long after the tape had stopped. And so, even in the modern world, the legend lived. On that 21st century has done nothing to silence it. Online forums carry scattered stories, campers who vanish without a trace, hikers who return babbling about pale women in the woods, hunters who swear they are being watched even when alone. Locals still refuse to talk, and outsiders are met with polite shrugs or cold stares if they ask too many questions. But sometimes, the truth leaks through. In 2007, a park ranger near the Mark Twain National Forest filed a report of unexplained figures spotted on night patrol. His words were cautious, professional, but the detail could not be ignored. For women, standing in the dark, eyes shining pale. The report was buried, marked as confidential. In 2015, a group of teenagers uploaded shaky phone footage from the hills outside Ava. The clip is short, blurred, but what it shows is chilling. A line of pale figures standing at the edge of a clearing, silent, unmoving, as though waiting. The video was taken down within hours, but not before copies spread across the internet. And most recently, in 2021, a farmer claimed his daughter vanished while walking home from a friend's house. The police searched, the town rallied, but she was never found. The farmer, weeping, told a neighbor he had seen her the next night, standing in the field at the tree line, with 3 pale women beside her. When he ran to her, they vanished. She was never seen again. The legend of the wanderer. Sisters is not gone, it is not history. It is alive, stretching from the 1890s to today, buried in silence, but always ready to surface. Why has the story been buried? Why was it banned from history? Perhaps because it is too dangerous. Perhaps because those who speak of it draw the sisters' attention. Perhaps because the Ozarks themselves demand silence, as if the land knows the curse must not be named. But the whispers remain. In the dark ridges, in the hollows where sunlight rarely reaches, in the fog that rises off the creeks at dawn. The Wanderer sisters are still there, watching, and if the stories are true, their numbers are still growing. So the warning passes down from the mouths of the old to the ears of the young. Though the names are not always spoken, do not walk the ridges after nightfall. Do not follow voices in the woods. Do not answer when you hear your name called from the dark, because some things are not meant to be remembered, and some legends are not legends at all. The Wanderer sisters were not killed by fire. They were not erased by silence. And they were never gone. They are still out there, waiting in the woods, and maybe just maybe closer than you think.